I'm a Berkeley graduate, and I'm happy to say we've stolen one of your best optometrists to be our dean, my friend of 25 years, John Flanagan, who is the bass player in Lost Faculties. So unfortunately, I'll miss getting to hear him and his band, but he and I will be drinking coffee on Solano Avenue in Berkeley soon. You should know that I'm a full-time employee of Carl Zeiss Meditech, and before that, Humphrey Instruments. I worked my way through Berkeley, working for Bill Humphrey at Humphrey Instruments. The opinions are my own and not necessarily those of Zeiss. And the illustrations shown here were done by Anders Hale's son for our book, Century Perimetry, which is the 4th edition of the Humphrey Primer, which is free. If you give me a business card, we'll send you one. I want to cover a couple things. Where are we now and where are we going? More emphasis on where are we now in the 21st century, but a little bit on where we're going. And I want to cover the topics mentioned there. First of all, highly standardized. When we started out in perimetry, we sort of said all bets are off. We will build a highly flexible machine. You can use it any way you want. And it had 3 colors, red, green, blue. It had 5 spot sizes, infinite number of testing patterns, super threshold testing, multiple strategies. That's sort of where it was. But over the years, we've figured out that some things worked, and predictably some things didn't, and we've narrowed it down radically. We're doing much less peripheral testing because normative data in the periphery is so highly variable that we don't know what's normal and what isn't. We're doing white testing because color testing didn't seem to help. Even swap didn't seem to help. I'll come back to that topic. We used to do a lot of super threshold testing, what we call screening testing. We don't do much of that anymore for a couple of reasons. A, it wasn't as sensitive to loss as threshold testing, and B, the threshold test got very quick. So the gains from doing super threshold testing, in my view, are minimal these days. And finally, having too many test patterns and strategies and colors just complicated our ability to follow patients. So there's strength simply in standardizing just because it's a better way of following patients. So where are we? What does standardized mean today in the 21st century? First of all, I think it means 24-2 CETA standard white. Harry Quigley in the last hour spoke about 24-2 having supplanted 30-2 testing. Multiple studies are out saying that you don't lose much. In fact, you gain some specificity in progression analyses using 24-2 testing. So it seems like the world has adopted that as a standardized test pattern. CETA standard has become the standard, at least with Humphrey Perimetry, and white has supplanted swap. I'll come back to that. Occasionally 10-2, Harry mentioned in advanced glaucoma. I think that's where it belongs. And I would say CETA fast as a strategy, use as needed, but not as your standard. Reasons for that, CETA standard is a unabashedly get it over with strategy. We did everything we could to make that quick. It is quick. World record is under 2 minutes for a test. So, but there are prices to that. It's much less resilient if patients are making mistakes or if they're badly instructed. CETA standard is called CETA standard for a reason. I recommend you use it. Whatever happened to blue-yellow testing? When we were designing the very first Humphrey perimeter, I read that blue-yellow testing was something of interest, and I called up Tony Adams, who was then dean of the School of Optometry at Berkeley, and said, I want to build that into the Humphrey perimeter, so if it does hit, we'll be ready for it. So we built it in. At least we built in the blue filter. I've chased that for 25 years, along with Chris Johnson, Pam Sample, Bob Weinreb, Tony Adams, the best and the brightest of the business. At the end of the day, I think it was a 25-year-long wild goose chase. I don't see the value in swap testing, and I don't recommend it. And there are papers that agree with me. A couple that have just said, hey, it's not more sensitive, it's not more specific, stay with white testing. Murray Fingerette and I had a hint of that a dozen years ago in some work we did where we were looking at size 6 swap, big stimuli, and just inadvertently stumbled across the finding that size 5 standard swap testing was not more sensitive in glaucoma patients than standard CETA white testing. So again, I think it's dead. We even did a CETA for it, hoping that that would fix it. So we've stretched the technology as far as we could, and at the end of the day, we're back to white testing. CETA standard was designed to be reproducible and as resilient to patient errors as a strategy it replaced. We've already said this. The big surprise was that in careful hands, CETA standard and CETA fast have about the same reproducibility, but the operative term is in careful hands. And most of the time, clinics can't be that careful. Under scientific conditions, CETA fast was as reproducible. I think in the trenches where we all make our living, that may not be true. So my advice, use CETA fast when necessary, but not routinely. And actually, CETA standard might be a little more sensitive. We're just counting the black squares in the pattern deviation plots. It's finding a little more at comparable specificity. CETA fast in red is comparable to the old strategy in sensitivity. CETA standard seems to be a little better. The 24-2 test pattern consists of the 54 most central test locations of the 30-2 pattern, and you've lost very little, and these papers substantiate that you really don't lose much when you go to the 24-2. Where are we now on change? 14 years into the 21st century, we're thinking differently about change, I believe. We're thinking about event analyses. An event analysis in progression analysis is a statistically significant change from baseline. And it's simply a change that is larger than the variability you typically see when you test patients multiple times. There's nothing terribly scientific about that. There was a lot of hard work to define what is normal variability in glaucoma patients, and we did that. But once we did that, it's a simple idea. The change we're observing here is larger than the test-retest variability, even at its worst. If the observed change, if you see a change and it's not statistically significant, it is small enough that it could be measurement variability, you have to assume it's measurement variability. It might be real, but you can't differentiate it from measurement variability, and therefore you need to walk away from it. However, event analyses can alert us that something of clinical importance may be happening. Then we have to decide if it's clinically significant. Just because it's statistically significant doesn't necessarily imply that it's clinically significant. In 1996, I proposed in Vancouver at Stephen Drance's retirement that we should stop changing therapy just because we've had statistically significant change. I proposed at that meeting that we should look at the rate of change as a measure of whether or not the patient is in significant danger of being visually disabled in their lifetime. That idea didn't gather much traction, as you might guess. It was a revolutionary idea. It seems sort of obvious today. But I was talking to glaucoma specialists who were used to taking patients to surgery if they had any sort of statistically significant progression, even minimal. I argued that they were blinding more patients than they were saving with that strategy. And it took another 10 years before that idea actually gained some traction, and notably it gained traction in Europe, not in North America first. It became part of the European Glaucoma Society preferred practice patterns about 7 years ago, and it's now received wisdom. And I guess the biggest compliment is that many of my ophthalmological friends think they thought of the idea first. Yeah. So here's a progression example. And note that the event analysis says probable progression, possible progression. What does that mean? That is perhaps the most specific and informative analysis on this page. And it is essentially saying that compared to these baselines, there have been enough points changing and changing consistently that this may be real progression. The criterion is that 3 points, the same 3 points, need to have shown change from baseline in 2 consecutive follow-up tests. If you see that in a third test, that's called likely progression, and that has a very high specificity. Is at least 98%. I actually think it's closer to 99% specificity. 1% of the time, it will flag in a stable patient. The criterion was developed for the early manifest glaucoma trial and proven there to work pretty well. It's been evaluated repeatedly. It is both sensitive and specific. And it's based upon testing hundreds of glaucoma patients 4 times in the space of a month. We organized a 9-center clinical trial around the world in which patients were brought in weekly for a month and given 3 tests, an old full threshold test, a CETA fast, and a CETA standard at each visit. We then looked at the variability from test to test over those 4 visits. That produced a probability solid which showed that test-retest variability depended at least on 3 things. How bad the field was in general. Fields with a bad MD were more variable than fields with a normal MD. How bad the point in question was at baseline. Points that started out damaged have higher variability in follow-up than points that are nearly normal. And finally, where is the point in the field? Variability generally increases as you get further and further from fixation. What you have there is a very complex probability solid, which you don't need to know because the computer knows it. And that's what it predicates the triangles on. Each test point has a different amount of variability depending on the stage of the glaucoma, the baseline defect depth, and the location. Using that, you get the triangles, which are then interpreted according to the early manifest glaucoma trial criteria. You expect to see some triangles here just randomly, and that's the reason we don't take it too seriously when a triangle shows up. But if you see change consistently in follow-up tests, that is a very specific sign of progression. So what would you do with this patient? The patient does have possible progression, but the rate is pretty slow, true? This patient's 83 years old. We probably wouldn't change the therapy even if the therapy was no therapy. Agree? I would probably say that even if this said likely progression. So this is an event analysis. It says something's going on. When we say, what is going on, and is it clinically significant? The answer is, yeah, something's going on, but it's slow. probably current therapy is fine, even if that is no therapy. Questions about this? We've even talked about patient's state of health as driving these decisions. If somebody's 83 years old and still playing tennis, like my father-in-law, competitive tennis, by the way, that's a different picture from 83 years old and has emphysema and diabetes, right? So whether we like to admit it or not, I believe we are now looking at this age graph and looking at the patient and saying, okay, this patient's 83, this one could go to 100. I've got to buckle down and get after this disease. Or this patient has terminal cancer and I have a different view of how aggressive I should be in my glaucoma therapy. So what do you think about these baselines? I was saying in the last hour that I believe that you should review each patient's fields once and choose the baseline yourself and not trust the computer to do that. What are my criteria for choosing a baseline? They need to be similar. They need to look about the same. They need to have similar MDs, and these do. They need to be both reliable. And especially, as Harry Quigley mentioned last hour, it's the false positives that matter, not the false negatives. So, and they need to have been taken at an appropriate time. If you've just made a radical change in therapy, you probably need new baselines. You probably should consider previous tests as old news and start again if the patient's just been sent to surgery, for instance. So, do these baselines look reasonable? Yes, they're not radically different from each other. They're representative and they're timely. What if they were different from each other? What if one had an MD of -3 and the other one had an MD of -8? Would you consider those as baselines? Probably not. One of them shouldn't be in there. Let's say if we looked at the third test and it was -8, then we've already seen a change even in the second baseline test. And we're now managing this patient looking for change from where they are. Probably we should use the second and third baseline test in that case, as long as they are both about -8 as your point of departure looking for change going forward. So if the baselines are distinctly different from each other, probably one of them needs to be taken off. It could be the second one if the patient just had a bad day. You need to look at the third test if the first two are radically different. This says slope significant. Remember I said event analyses are all about statistics. I will argue that rate of progression is not about statistical significance. The most important bit of information in rate of progression is the estimated progression rate. Whether that's statistically significant or not, if that rate looks clinically significant, you need to examine the situation more carefully. If it's not statistically significant, you may need to do a confirmatory test to confirm the rate. But the flag is up if that looks like a dangerous rate to you, because it could be important to the patient. We've even gone to the point of taking this significance statement off the printout simply because too many of my friends, key opinion leaders in glaucoma, I might add, were confusing that statement with clinical significance. And they were taking patients to treatment, surgery sometimes, not based on the rate of progression, but based on the fact that the rate of progression was considered statistically significant. That's the wrong way of looking at the data. Questions about that? Arguments? Please.
Mike, I completely agree. I showed an example in the talk before of somebody with high variability early on.
Yep.
So you could not get statistical significance, but if anybody looking at the line would see this going downhill. That's the point.
And if you really are in the tank about that, they need to be examined again to prove or disprove the worry that we have about clinical significance. So, a little bit more, what do the black triangles mean? The black triangles come up, as I explained, based on a big probability solid. What are we looking at? We're looking not at a change which exceeds the average reproducibility. We're looking at a change that exceeds all but 1 in 20 test-retest situations. Fewer than 5% of the time, you will see a change that large randomly. That's statistically significant. It also means that 5% of the time you'll see a black triangle in a stable point in the field. So you have to expect a few of these in a printout. Again, it's the consistency with which they show up that's important. This looks at the sensitivity of the EMGT criteria compared to criteria that were developed for 2 clinical trials in the 1990s. And it simply points out that the EMGT is a little more sensitive in detecting change over time. And I believe that's probably the case. It's highly specific, and it's hard to tease that out of the literature. Anders Hale looked at it in a paper, this paper, from, I believe, 2008, in which he stated in the discussion of the paper that a series of tests, greater than 20 tests, had an overall specificity of 90% for 30-2, 96% for 24-2. However, that's for the whole series. That says in a series of 20 tests, only 10% of the time did you see any test have a false positive of the 20. So we're interested clinically on a per test basis. We're sitting there with Mrs. Jones, we're looking at her test results, and we're saying, what are the chances that this EMGT analysis represents a false positive finding? That's a single test. So it's some fraction of 10% false positive rate, right? In 20 tests, we only had 10% false positives. In one test, I'm guessing 1 or 2%, and that's conservative. It also points out that 24-2 tests are even more specific. So in series of more than 20 tests, Anders was only finding false positives, any false positive out of 20, 4% of the time. Now we're talking about analyses that are specific somewhere in this region. And there's an unpublished paper by a friend of mine, I'm after him to publish it, in which he confirms this, having tested 50 glaucomas repeatedly 5 times and looked at the specificity. And in that finding, it's also in this range. So you can, I think, go to the bank with knowing that this is a highly specific analysis. However, it depends on who you apply it to. Let's think about glaucoma patients. They have been reported to progress measurably about 10% per year, roughly. Does that number make sense to you, Harry? It's close. So if you have a 10% chance that the person sitting in front of you has progressed just on the basis of epidemiology, and you have a test which has 1% false positives and it's positive, the odds are in the realm of 10 to 1 that this is real progression. This is probably a significant finding for you. However, what if you're following ocular hypertensives who are progressing at 1 or 2% per year, epidemiologically speaking? Even a 1% false positive rate is too much in that case, because now we're talking about a 50-50 shot. It could be a false positive, could be a true positive. In that case, I believe you need further evidence to take this seriously. Questions about that? You're all too polite. So, using the EMGT criteria, significant progression was associated with a change in MD of a little less than 2 decibels. That was with the old testing strategy, and that's with the 30-2 test. So that defines for us at least 10 steps from normal to, let's say, early disability at minus 20 dB of MD. So this analysis is, and you also get additional steps which would not be analyzed in this way, but for which perimetry is useful. This says to me that in spite of the fact that I've spent the last 10 years building OCTs, perimetry is still the best progression machine out there. OCT will pass it. It's going to pass it, and it's going to pass it in the next 5 years. But as of 2014, perimetry, unfortunately, is the best measure of glaucomatous progression that we have today. It may also be worth pointing out that, that the normal range for MD is down to 2 or 3 dB. A minus 2 dB MD is still within the normal range. We can detect changes that are sensitive enough with this technique that you may still be in the normal range for mean deviation when you detect statistically significant change from baseline. And that's also becoming true in OCT, as I'll cover in a bit. So what are its weaknesses? The analysis is only as good as your choice of baseline. If you choose inappropriate baselines, then you have garbage in, garbage out. That's where it's vulnerable. That's where you have to pay attention. It's now possible to have stat pack analysis for the Humphrey perimeter, at least, off the instrument and on your computer. That's where I would recommend you do these baseline assessments. That software is now available. I built it in 1996, nobody bought it, so we took it off the market. It's back. Let's talk about patient management. Patient instruction, patient comfort are the single most fertile area for improvement in visual field testing that I can think of. We've worked on the technology I've worked on it for 30 years, but the most obvious improvements are about communication, staff training, paying more attention to ergonomics, and taking advantage of improved data management techniques. The perimeter is automated, the patients are not. Most of what we do in the clinic can be called procedures. We do things to people. Perimetry is a task, and it's a task that the patient has to learn how to do and has to be taught how to do. So I would suggest that you spend 1 minute once with each new patient who's new to perimetry, and say 3 things. Number 1, this is not a test, this is a measurement. It's like measuring you for new shoes. Don't worry, there's no pass, there's no fail. We want to know how well you see, we want to quantify it. 2, most of the time you will not see the test light. The machine is diabolical, devilish. It's going to turn the light down till you can't see it. Half the time you won't see it. Don't let this bother you. 3, the perimeter is designed to wait for you. And we do. We know exactly their reaction time because we know when the shutter opened. We know when their thumb pressed the button. We know their reaction time. We will wait for them Tell them not to feel rushed. Second, you won't have time to answer all their questions. Your staff needs to, for the first time at least that somebody undergoes perimetry. They will have a list of questions. Your staff needs to take them through that once. Maybe some patients twice, but at least once. We outline these questions and what the staff needs to do in Chapter 2 of the Humphrey Primer. Give me your card, I'll send you a copy, as long as you agree to read Chapter 2. So if you do this, if you spend 1 extra minute, and if your staff spends 1 extra minute with new patients, not every time, but with new patients, I believe that the patients will be less anxious, they'll produce more reliable results, and guess what? They'll be more compliant with your request to return for follow-up examination. It's worthwhile to work with standardized instructions for the patient, even if your staff doesn't use them. We've written some. If you don't like ours, write your own. But have your staff refer to those, even if they don't say them verbatim. Why is that? Because they will learn the relevant points. And the alternative is new staff members will learn from old staff members who learn from older staff members. It gets lost. Use our instructions or write your own. Have them available to the staff. Make sure they've at least read them, even if they don't use them. Perimetry takes longer than any office procedure that we in this audience do. Most glaucoma patients are not so young. They will be more compliant if you make them comfortable. And I've spent weeks trying to improve the ergonomics of this device. I've sat in the offices of multiple mechanical engineers, taking millimeters out of this device to improve its ergonomics. Take advantage of that. First of all, use a table that allows the patient to get under the perimeter. Provide an adjustable chair. Train your techs to adjust the chair so that the patient's feet are flat on the floor. Simple idea. Lots and lots of diminutive Asian ladies in my own practice would be perched with their feet dangling down there for 20, 30 minutes. It's not comfortable. And then train your techs to adjust the table so that the patient's chin comfortably rests on it. And by comfortably, I don't mean this. Comfortably is like you would sit at a dinner table, upright. That means that the patient's legs are under the table, just like they would be at dinner. If you let the patients do this, or let the staff do this to your patients, two bad things happen. There's too much weight on the chin. Patients will complain about all the weight in their chin. Second, necks don't flex upward very far. It's not comfortable to be in this position. This is a guarantee that they're going to be resistant to doing perimetry at the next visit. Simple stuff. Get them in that position, you'll have much happier patients. At least once in your life, take a field test. Insist that your staff does a field test once a year. If they've taken field tests, they know what it's like. If they haven't taken field tests, they're unsympathetic. They won't know how to explain the task to patients. Experience counts. And insist that in novice patients, first-time patients, that your techs actually look in on them or even stay with them the whole time. The first test, not every test, just the first one. Data management is essential, especially when using these progression analyses, because the computer's stupid. It will only compare tests that it knows to be all the same patient. How does it do that? It's stupid. The last name and the first name need to be spelled identically. The birth date needs to be the same. The ID number needs to be the same. What's the best way of making sure that happens? Don't enter it every time. Look it up. The perimeters are programmed to do this, even in standalone mode. You can go in and retrieve the old patient data, along with refractive correction and date of birth and everything. Have your staff pull it up that way rather than entering it de novo at each visit. That will help ensure that your data are comparable. There's software out there that will let you pull this off of your EMR, if that's the way you want to do it. There's software that will give you daily task lists so that the tech is selecting from a short list, oh, that Mrs. Jones. It selects it, and then Mrs. Jones, correct spelling, her birth date, come over, and you're off and running. Saves you time, reduces errors, allows you to do progression analyses. These are the names of American presidents. I should have had some Canadian premiers in here, but I hope that Brian Mulrooney will forgive me. This can save you time that can be spent otherwise. This is simply a report viewer, which brings reports into your examination lane or your office or wherever you want them, and puts them in front of you instead of having you paw through the chart looking for that last photograph that you want to get to. So it can be all in front of you, save you time, allow you to spend more time making the decisions that only you can make. The idea here is that it's now possible to take all your perimetry data, if you have multiple perimeters, all your OCT data, if you have multiple OCTs, and put them in single databases, one for perimetry, one for OCT, one for photographs, on your office server. Good things happen. First of all, they get backed up more routinely. They're safer. Second, if all your perimetry data is in one place, then you can use these analysis methods and not have to worry about which perimeter Mrs. Jones was tested on. Same thing for OCT analyses. So this is available. It's recently available, and I think it's a no-brainer. This, again, is doing your own analysis. And doing your own analysis can give you important findings, and Harry was talking about this last hour. This is showing statistically significant change over time in a patient whose RNFL, average RNFL, is still in the normal range. So we're here to talk mostly about perimetry, but in the spirit of improved access to data, this kind of change can show up in patients that are still in the green. Data management can also allow you to combine reports in one place. So you see the perimetry, you see the OCT all in one report. You don't have to go looking for it. Again, the goal here is to get you to a position where you're doing the things only you can do, and you're not chasing data. So in summary, the role of the perimetrist is to transfer accurate patient ID information into the perimeter, hopefully electronically, to carefully instruct inexperienced patients, to make sure the patient's comfortably seated at the perimeter, and to monitor and encourage the patient from time to time. Your role, spend a minute once with each new perimetry patient, explain to them the 3 important facts about perimetry, train and motivate your staff, and take advantage of the new data management capabilities that are now available to you. How much time we got?
Just have a couple minutes.
Okay, so looking into the future, I think we're going to see perimetry improve in reproducibility and dynamic range over the next few years. We're spending a lot of time trying to improve the workflow, and the electronics is a big part of that. And we're looking for improved metrics of reliability. Harry mentioned that false positives are really the only one reliability metric that's any good in the current perimetry software, and I agree with him. Anders Hale and I are thinking about taking false negatives off the printout, for instance, and we want to eliminate the Hale-Krakow method. Anders Hale wants to eliminate the Hale-Krakow method and rely exclusively on gaze tracking, and I think we're approaching the point where we can do that. But there are other reliability indices that we will develop and which you will see. Are we likely to depart from standard Goldman white-on-white testing? I don't think so. We've been around and around with alternative strategies and psychophysical stimuli, and nothing has really risen that's clearly superior. So I think that Goldman style perimetry is here for the foreseeable future in any case. I do think that the role of perimetry will evolve and that we will rely increasingly on imaging in future for finding change. We're not there yet. Unfortunately, perimetry is still your best tool, but that will change over the coming years. It all starts with you. Thanks.